routine bank visit turns into an unexpected battle for respect when one woman is judged solely by her appearance. As tensions escalate, the employees have no idea they're humiliating the very person who signs their paychecks. What happens when she finally reveals who she really is? Let us know in the comments section below. Kendra Sullivan stepped into the bank, her sneakers making soft squeaks against the polished tile floor. The air inside was crisp, unnaturally cold, as if they kept the temperature low to remind customers they were in a place of business. It was just another errand, something that should have taken 10 minutes at most. Yet, the moment she walked in, she could feel it, that shift in the atmosphere, the way the security guard near the entrance subtly adjusted his posture, the way the teller at the front counter barely glanced her way before looking past her as if she were invisible. She had seen it before, felt it before. Dressed in simple black leggings, an oversized sweatshirt, and a baseball cap pulled low over her braided hair, Kendra looked like any other working woman running errands on her day off. There were no designer bags, no expensive jewelry, no immediate signs of wealth, just comfort, practicality, and that was the problem. She walked up to the sign-in kiosk, tapping in her information for a withdrawal, a substantial one, enough that it required an in-person verification, nothing out of the ordinary, for her at least. Yet, as she stood waiting, her fingers resting lightly on the counter, she noticed something. The older white woman who had walked in after her, she was helped immediately. A teller called her forward before she even reached the queue. The man in the expensive suit, holding nothing but a phone, escorted to a private banker within seconds. But Kendra, she stood and waited. Minutes passed. Then more. Her patience stretched thin, but she kept her expression neutral. It wasn't the first time she'd been overlooked, underestimated, dismissed. Even in her own company, she'd had to remind people who she was. Not with arrogance, but with undeniable results. This bank, this very branch, it belonged to her. She had founded this financial institution from the ground up, building it into a billion-dollar empire. She was the CEO, the owner, the highest authority in the entire corporation. And yet here she was, ignored in the very place that bore her name. A young teller, mid-20s, with a name tag that read Jessica, finally acknowledged her. But the smile on her face wasn't warm. It was forced, tight, guarded. "Can I help you?" Kendra tilted her head slightly. "I'm here to make a withdrawal." Jessica hesitated, glancing at the screen where Kendra's transaction details had already been entered. Then, with a polite but dismissive nod, she said, "I'll need to see your ID." Kendra slid her driver's license across the counter. Jessica barely glanced at it before pursing her lips. "And do you have proof of account ownership? A debit card? A checkbook?" "A checkbook? Who still carried those?" Kendra exhaled slowly. "I have my online banking app, my account details. I used this same ID to set up my account. That should be enough." Jessica's expression didn't change. If anything, her skepticism deepened. "Just a moment," she said, taking the ID and disappearing into the back. Kendra watched as Jessica whispered something to another teller, then to the branch manager, a middle-aged man in a navy blue suit who glanced over at Kendra like she was a problem, like she was suspicious, like she didn't belong. She felt her stomach tighten, not in fear, but in recognition. They saw a black woman making a large withdrawal and assumed the worst. That was the issue. That was always the issue. A few more minutes passed before the branch manager approached. His smile was wider than Jessica's, but just as empty. "Ms. Sullivan," he said, handing back her ID. "I'm sorry, but we have a policy on large cash withdrawals. We need further verification before we can process this." Kendra arched an eyebrow. "I've provided my ID. What more do you need?" "Well, for security reasons, we typically require customers to notify us in advance for withdrawals over a certain amount." Her jaw clenched. "That's not in your policy. It's a case-by-case basis," he said smoothly. And unfortunately, in this case, we can't move forward with the transaction at this time." Kendra let out a short breath through her nose. She could feel it now. The eyes on her. The security guard watching her closely. The other tellers whispering behind their desks. The customers throwing quick, uneasy glances in her direction. Her mind ran through the scenarios. She could force the issue, demand her money, make a scene. Or she could wait, let them dig themselves deeper into the hole they were so blindly creating. She chose the latter. Because she had time. Because she wanted to see how far this would go. So, she took a step back, crossing her arms. "So, let me get this straight," she said slowly. "You don't believe I have access to my own money?" The manager's polite mask faltered just for a second. "It's not about belief, Miss Sullivan. It's about procedure." She nodded. "Right. And if I were someone else, dressed differently, would I be having this problem?" His face twitched. He knew exactly what she meant. Of course not. He lied. She could have stopped it there. Could have spared him the embarrassment that was about to come. But why should she? She smiled. Not a kind smile, not a forgiving one, but the kind that said, "You have no idea what's about to happen." "Well," she said, pulling her phone from her pocket, "since we're following procedure, let's do it right." She tapped on her screen, scrolling through her contacts until she found the number she wanted. Then, with the manager and tellers watching, she pressed call. The ringing only lasted a second before a voice picked up. "Hello, Ms. Sullivan. How can I assist you?" Kendra met the manager's eyes. Then, with a tone as smooth as silk, she said, "I'm standing in one of our bank branches right now, being refused access to my own funds. Would you like to explain to your staff exactly who I am?" The manager's face drained of color. And just like that, the game was over. The silence at the counter stretched uncomfortably. The branch manager's face had gone from pale to a sickly shade of pink, his eyes darting from Kendra's phone to her face, as if trying to determine whether this was a bluff. The tellers behind him had stopped whispering. The security guard had shifted, subtly placing a hand near his belt, like he expected this to escalate. Kendra watched them all, her expression neutral, the phone still held to her ear. "Miss Sullivan?" the voice on the other end prompted. The moment hung heavy. The manager seemed to be searching for a way out of this, but there was none. Kendra leaned against the counter, voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight. "You still there, Victor?" The branch manager flinched. He recognized the name. Victor Ramirez, Chief Operating Officer of the entire bank. "Yes, Miss Sullivan," Victor said, his tone instantly shifting to one of alert professionalism. "Which branch are you at?" Kendra's smile didn't reach her eyes. "I'm at the downtown location, and I'm being told I can't access my own funds because I don't fit the case-by-case requirements." There was a brief silence on the other end before Victor exhaled sharply. "Put me on speaker." Kendra didn't hesitate. She tapped the button, and the quiet hum of the bank was immediately filled with Victor's controlled but unmistakably furious voice. "This is Victor Ramirez, Chief Operating Officer," he announced. "Who am I speaking to?" The branch manager, still frozen in place, finally found his voice. Mr. Ramirez, this is Matthew Parks. I'm the—" "I know who you are," Victor cut him off, his voice sharp. "And I need you to tell me right now why the hell you're refusing service to our CEO." Gasps rippled through the bank. Several customers who had been casually observing the scene visibly reacted. A woman near the loan officer's desk let out a choked, "Oh my God!" One of the tellers actually dropped her pen. Jessica, the young teller who had started this entire mess, visibly shrank behind the counter. And the branch manager? He looked like he might throw up. Kendra didn't take her eyes off him. She saw every emotion flicker across his face. Shock, disbelief, horror, and worst of all, fear. "I had no idea, sir," he stammered. Victor didn't let up. "Did no one in this branch stop for even 1 second to verify who they were speaking to? Or was it just easier to assume that a black woman in casual clothes must be trying to take money that isn't hers? Jessica, still standing at the teller station, winced at the words. Matthew tried to recover. I assure you, Mr. Ramirez, that was not our intention. It was simply protocol. Protocol, Victor repeated, his tone cold. Tell me, Matthew, would you have made a white man in a suit go through this protocol? Silence. Kendra finally spoke again, her voice deceptively soft. It's a fair question. Matthew licked his lips, his mouth opening and closing, but he had no good answer. Victor didn't wait for him to come up with one. I want every teller, every employee, and especially you, Matthew, to listen to me very carefully. This woman is the reason you have jobs. She is the reason this branch exists. Every single policy, every single transaction you process, every dollar that comes through here, it all happens because she built this bank from nothing. He let that sink in for a moment before continuing. And instead of recognizing the CEO of your own institution, you treated her like a criminal, you humiliated her, and you did it publicly. Matthew looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Kendra, still calm, finally reached for her ID on the counter. I don't like scenes, she said, flicking her gaze between Matthew and Jessica. I didn't walk in here looking for one. I just wanted to handle a simple transaction like any other customer. But what happened here today? She shook her head. It's a pattern, and I'm sick of seeing it happen in my own company. Matthew blurted out the only defense he could think of. Miss Sullivan, please understand. We were just following the rules. No, Kendra said sharply, cutting him off. You were following bias. The same bias that makes someone like me wait while others get immediate service. The same bias that makes you second-guess my identity before even checking the system. The same bias that, frankly, makes you unfit to be managing this branch. Matthew's face drained of all color. Matthew. Sullivan, please. Victor's voice came through the speaker, firm and final. You're done, Matthew. The branch manager's breath caught. You'll be receiving official notice from HR. Effective immediately, you are relieved of your position. Jessica looked like she might faint. Victor's voice wasn't done. As for the rest of you, I will personally be reviewing every complaint, every performance report, and every single recorded customer interaction at this branch over the last 6 months. And if this wasn't an isolated incident, if I find even one more case like this, he exhaled sharply. You can expect a lot more empty desks in this building. The tellers looked at each other, fear creeping into their eyes. Matthew opened his mouth as if to protest, but Kendra had already turned her back to him. The conversation was over. She tapped off the call, slipped her phone into her pocket, and finally met Jessica's wide, terrified eyes. You're young, Kendra said quietly. You have time to unlearn things. Make sure you do. Jessica nodded furiously, eyes welling with tears. Kendrick took a slow breath. The tension in the room was suffocating, but she had felt worse in boardrooms where men underestimated her. This wasn't new. But she was done letting it slide. She turned back to the counter. Now, if it's not too much trouble, she said, I'd like to withdraw my money. Jessica fumbled to comply, her hands visibly shaking as she counted out the bills. As Kendra waited, she felt the shift in the room. The way people looked at her now. Not with suspicion, not with dismissal, but with something very different. Recognition. By the time she collected her cash and turned toward the exit, the entire bank was still dead silent. The security guard, who had been watching her so closely earlier, he looked away as she passed. Kendra didn't smirk, didn't gloat. She just walked out, head held high, cash in hand. And as she stepped into the street, a single thought settled into her mind. This wouldn't be the last time she had to teach this lesson, but today she had made damn sure they learned. Kendra walked out of the bank, the weight of the encounter still lingering in the air around her. The street outside felt different, as if the world had slightly adjusted itself to acknowledge what had just happened. She inhaled deeply, letting the crisp air clear the tension from her chest. This wasn't the first time she had been underestimated, dismissed, or disrespected because of her appearance, but this time she had made them see. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, she heard quick footsteps behind her. "Miss Sullivan, wait." She turned to see Jessica, the young teller, jogging after her, looking nervous but determined. Kendra stopped, raising an eyebrow, waiting. Jessica caught her breath before speaking. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for the way I acted in there." Kendra studied her for a moment. The girl looked genuinely shaken, her fingers twisting the hem of her uniform. Jessica took a deep breath. "I knew I was being unfair the second I questioned you, but I did it anyway, and I just didn't think. And I should have." Kendra let the silence hang between them, letting Jessica feel the weight of her own words. Finally, she nodded. "And?" Jessica swallowed. "And I want to do better." That was something. Kendra tilted her head slightly. "Why?" Jessica blinked at the question, as if it was obvious. "Because it's the right thing to do." "That's not enough," Kendra said simply. Jessica hesitated. Kendra crossed her arms. "You're young. You'll be given more chances than someone like me ever was. But if you're only trying to do better because of what happened today, you're going to fall right back into the same pattern. You have to want to change, not just because you got called out, but because you truly understand the problem." Jessica looked down, her jaw tightening. Kendra could see the battle happening in her mind. After a moment, Jessica straightened. "I do." Her voice was steady now. "I grew up in a small town. People looked like me, thought like me, and if I'm honest, I've never questioned how that shaped the way I see people. But today," she let out a breath, "today was different. I felt it, and I don't ever want to be on the wrong side of that again." Kendra studied her for another long moment, then nodded. "Good." Jessica let out a breath, looking like she'd been holding it in. "Thank you." Kendra lifted a shoulder in a half shrug. "Don't thank me. Just be better." Jessica nodded quickly before turning back toward the bank, her steps lighter but still uncertain. Kendra watched her go, wondering if the girl would actually follow through on her words. She hoped so. But she wasn't going to wait around to find out. She checked her watch, realizing she was running behind for her next meeting. With a final glance at the bank, she turned and made her way toward her parked car. By the time she slid into the driver's seat and pulled out her phone, she already had 2 missed calls from Victor and an email from HR confirming Matthew's termination. She exhaled, rubbing her temple. It wasn't about him, not really. It was about what he represented. A culture that had been allowed to fester, unchecked under her own leadership. That part stung. She had built this company from the ground up. She had fought to be seen, to be heard, to be respected in rooms where she wasn't welcome. And yet, despite all of that, her own employees, the very people who should have known her name, her face, her authority, had failed her. She knew what that meant. It wasn't just about one bad manager. It was about the entire culture of her bank. And that was her responsibility to fix. Her fingers tapped absently against the steering wheel as she considered her next move. This wasn't going to be solved with one firing. This wasn't going to be handled with just a company-wasty email about diversity and inclusion. This needed to be systemic. Her thoughts were interrupted by her phone buzzing again. She checked the screen. Victor. She answered on the second ring. "Tell me you're already drafting a company-wide audit," she said without preamble. Victor let out a low chuckle. "I already have my team on it. Every branch, every regional manager, Every employee evaluation, and I'm personally sitting in on the next executive meeting." Kendra smiled slightly. "Good." A beat of silence. Then Victor spoke again, his voice quieter. "I know this wasn't easy for you." She let out a slow breath. "It shouldn't have to be," she admitted. "But here we are." Victor didn't argue. "I'll send you the full report by the end of the week. Anything else you want me to do?" Kendra thought about it for a moment. Then she said, "Yeah. Set up a meeting with every branch manager in the company. I want to see them, face to face." Victor let out a low whistle. "That's going to make a lot of people sweat." Kendra's voice was firm. "It should." She ended the call and stared out at the city skyline through her windshield. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every customer who had ever been treated the way she had been treated today. Every black person who had walked into a bank and felt unwelcome in a space they had every right to be in. She had the power to change that, and she damn well was going to. Without another word, she started the car and drove off, already planning her next move. Because this was just the beginning. Kendra stood at the front of the massive conference room, her gaze sweeping across the faces of every branch manager in her company. The tension in the air was thick, the kind of charged silence that made people shift uncomfortably in their seats. She let it sit for a moment. Let them feel it. She wanted them to be uncomfortable, because she had been uncomfortable. Because every black customer who had walked into one of their branches and been treated like a suspect had been uncomfortable. She took a slow breath and finally spoke. "I know why you're all here." Her voice was calm, even. "And I know most of you are wondering if this meeting is just about what happened at the downtown branch last week." A few people flinched at the mention. Some dropped their eyes. Others straightened, trying to maintain composure. "It's not," Kendra continued. "This is about all of you. About how this company, the one I built, the one I trusted you all to run with integrity, failed me. And if it failed me, then it has failed a hell of a lot of other people." Silence. A few of them looked like they wanted to defend themselves, to shift the blame elsewhere, but no one dared to speak. "Good." She took a step forward, pressing her hands flat against the long glass table. "I need you all to understand something," she said, her tone sharp now. "I could have walked into that bank wearing a suit. I could have dropped my name the second I stepped inside. I could have demanded immediate service, and you know what? I still would have been watched. I still would have been questioned. Because the problem isn't the clothes I wear or the title I hold. The problem is what you and your employees assume when you see someone like me." She let the words hang in the air, heavy, unrelenting. "I am not the first black person to walk into one of our banks and be treated like an outsider. And until all of you understand what that means, this company will continue to be part of the problem." She could see it now. The quiet guilt creeping onto some of their faces. The realization settling in. Some, though, still looked stiff, defensive. So she went for the jugular. "Let's talk about the numbers," she said, picking up the tablet in front of her and tapping the screen. "Our customer demographic reports show that black clients account for nearly 40% of our customer base. And yet," she looked up, locking eyes with the regional manager sitting at the far end of the table, "they account for 72% of flagged transactions, additional security screenings, and account holds." A murmur ran through the room. She turned to another page. "Black wisdom has been shared with me too, peeping. Some scriptures have been read from the Bible. Less than 15% of frontline workers, loan officers, advisors, are black." She could feel the shift happening now, because this wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was cold, hard data. It was indisputable. She tossed the tablet onto the table. "This isn't a coincidence. This isn't just how the numbers played out. This is bias. Plain and simple. Whether intentional or not, we have allowed discrimination to exist within our own walls, and I will not tolerate it any longer." She straightened, arms crossing over her chest. "So, Here's what's going to happen. Now, the room was dead silent. You will each conduct a full review of your hiring and promotion practices. I want to see diversity in leadership, not just on the teller line. She watched the faces in the room, gauging reactions. Some were nodding, others were scribbling notes, and a few still looked rigid, unmoved. She smiled, a slow, sharp thing. And to be clear, she added, if I don't see real change within the next 6 months, some of you will be looking for new jobs. That got their attention. One of the senior branch managers, an older white man with a tired expression, finally spoke. Ms. Sullivan, with all due respect, change like this takes time. We can't just... She cut him off. It takes effort, and it takes a choice. Either you change, or you step aside for someone who will. His mouth snapped shut. She gave it a beat, then continued. We will be implementing bias training for every single employee, from tellers to loan officers to managers like you. And it won't just be a PowerPoint you click through in 20 minutes. It will be real, immersive, and mandatory. Another pause. She could see some of them shifting now, realizing this wasn't just a warning, this was a directive. Furthermore, she continued, we are implementing a customer advocacy department that will specifically track and respond to complaints related to discrimination and unfair treatment. No more "we'll look into it" responses. No more brushing it under the rug. Every incident will be investigated, and if any of you are found to be part of the problem... She let that last sentence linger, unfinished, because they all knew exactly what she meant. There were no excuses left, no explanations, no misunderstandings. This was a reckoning. She picked up the tablet again, swiping to the last set of numbers. I want every single branch implementing community outreach programs, financial literacy classes, small business mentorships. I want our bank to actually serve the people who bank with us. A younger manager, maybe early 30s, raised a hesitant hand. Ms. Sullivan, this is a lot to process. But I agree with you, we do need to do better. How do we start? Kendra studied him. He was nervous, but there was sincerity in his eyes. She nodded slightly. It starts with hiring practices, promotions, trusting the people you've overlooked. You've got talented employees sitting right under your noses, but you don't see them because they don't look like what you expect. She let her gaze sweep the room one last time. This company will not be part of the cycle that keeps black and brown customers and employees at a disadvantage. It will be a place that recognizes value over bias. If you can't get behind that, she gave a slow shrug, then you don't belong here. Silence. Then, slowly, a few heads nodded, then a few more. She could see the shift happening in real time. Some of them were just scared of losing their jobs, but some actually got it. She could work with that. She exhaled, nodding once. Meeting adjourned. She turned, walking out of the room without another word, because the real work started now.